Pete just almost ruined it a while ago because he said publicly in front of everybody, "What are you doing the Halloween lesson tonight for?" We're going to look at the Witch of En Dor, just in case you were wondering. In your text there in 1 Samuel, the 28th chapter, there's some interesting things going on. I guess I should start with the idea, there's coming up here shortly is the Halloween deal, and we're going to have here in Hamilton Halloween on the square, and I'm not opposed at all to candy. If anybody who knows me, you know I like candy, okay? I don't have a problem with that. Dressing up in costumes, never been one of my favorite things. People think I do that anyway because I wear boots, but that's not really the case. But anyway, there's a lot of things about many of the holidays that we celebrate here in America. But one of the things I think we ought to caution ourselves about sometimes is the origins of some of these holidays, where they come from, and why it is it might be wise for us to be very cautious how we celebrate them. We as Christians don't want to give people the wrong impression, and most people don't know basically where some of these holidays start and how they came about. Etymology, or if you would, use the term for words, of the concept of Halloween, it comes from All Hallows Eve, the day prior to where all the dead is basically worshipped. I know there's some debate about how that works, but it is a holiday that was taken, and I'm not trying to denigrate or look down upon anyone who is Catholic, but the Catholics were very good at employing what Rome did when Rome took over the world. Rome would go into a place and they would have foreign gods, and they learned right off the bat that when you give impetus to a people, you give them a reason to fight. Religion is one of those reasons people will fight. And so if you go in and take them over and tell them you're not going to worship your gods anymore, we're going to give you a fresh set. Very often you ran against zealots, individuals who were just on fire for their religious belief, and it was hopeless. And so that being the case, one of the things the Romans did very effectively would go into a foreign culture and say, tell you what we're going to do, you guys go ahead and worship your own gods. We may give them a new name because we're in Rome and speak Latin or whatever, but we'll let you worship it, and we'll just incorporate them too, and we'll all do the same thing. Which you can imagine why that was a real problem for the Jews, and the Jews were such a thorn in the side for the Romans because they stuck with the monotheism of the Old Testament. Well, when you come to Christians, Christians suffered during the Roman Empire era when the church first began, because they would not worship, bow down, or offer incense, or whatever the case may be, to gods that were not gods. They wouldn't worship idols. And so that went against the grain of the culture at the time. Even when the Romans were trying to have everybody on the same page, just give your God a new name and we'll go with it and be okay. Well, Catholicism, which is a corruption of Christianity, which began early, in fact, I believe is recorded in the New Testament when we're told about, Timothy, watch out for folks because they're going to teach you that you're to abstain from certain meats or foods and forbidding to marry. And boy, when you look at Catholicism, their priests for a long time were not allowed, still are not allowed to marry. In fact, that was one of the big problems Martin Luther had when the Reformation started virtually by him, that he looked at the Bible and said, well, it's not good for man to be alone, one of his arguments, and therefore God made female for him so the two could be one flesh. How is it that you're more holy when you go against what God teaches? Good argument. And so he went crosswise with Catholicism. But when Catholicism would go in and do mission work and take over places, and here in Texas, Catholicism was very strong. Catholicism had its missionaries over here, and they built their temples and masses and all that kind of stuff, had them over here in Texas, even long before it was Texas. And during their mission work, turned lots of folks into Catholics. But one of the things they discovered is when the locals have their own gods and their own idols, instead of totally stomping them out, just Christianize them. I mean, that's where we get the concept of Easter. The Easter was after a fertilization god of spring, had really nothing to do with Christ's resurrection whatsoever, but that was the connect Catholicism could make to make it happen. It's the same thing with Christmas. Jesus was born nowhere in the winter, nowhere near the winter, and yet here we are in the middle of winter, December 25th, celebrating Christ's birth, which didn't happen then. It's like that in many things. Well, same kind of thing with All Hallows Eve. Its origination had to do with incorporating things from religions who worship the dead. And so you had All Hallows Eve and so forth. Now the fact that witches and warlocks and all the manner of afterlife worship has existed basically since dirt, long time, is not argued. In fact, we're looking at a text here where it talks about the fact that, you know, there was this witch in the kingdom of Israel that even after there was the threat of being put to death, and by the way, just as a definition, this is something for you. When you're studying your Bible, allow God to define your terms for you. There are a lot of things stated in Deuteronomy about being cut off. And it's a figurative expression, Hebraism, that means something specifically that a lot of people don't understand. But if you'll notice in this verse, in chapter 28 of 1 Samuel, verse 9, the Witch of En Dor is very concerned, as Saul in disguise is trying to get her to reveal herself and do a seance so he can contact Samuel and get a word on how the battle's going to go with Philistines. Anyway, there's a term used there, how he has cut off the medium. Saul had done this throughout all the land. Cut off. Well, what does that mean? Well, look further in the verse and he explains what cut off means. She says, why then do you lay a snare for my life? Being cut off had to do with your life. It was in jeopardy. And further, to cause me to die. Anytime you read in Deuteronomy, for instance, where somebody does something wrong and they are to be cut off, I've read scholars that said, well, that just means that they slapped him on the wrist and kicked him out of camp. No, it doesn't. Not according to the Bible. According to the Bible, it means you kill him. And that's the way God dealt with things like that back in the day. And it solved a lot of problems. They didn't have witches coming out of the closet, to be sure. Nevertheless, in Deuteronomy 18, if you want to look at that, this gives you an indicator of some of the rampant false worship that was going on in the land of Canaan, wherein God had given at least 400 years for these people to repent and change their ways. But here we have a listing of things that were going on there. I'm going to be reading from Deuteronomy 18:10. God is commanding against Israel, don't do this, okay? There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire. That's talking about offering your little baby into the hands of this burning idol Moloch and frying them alive. We've talked about that before. Or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. Now listen to what he says. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord. And because of the abominations of the Lord your God drives them out from before you. It's these things they did that God got fed up with. They were an abomination and drove those people out through the medium of Israel going in and conquering the land. Now, having put that in its context, when you come back over here, it's amazing to me that after that event and that statement that Moses makes to these people, that we are finding hundreds of years later, during the reign of King Saul, the first king, that you still have problems with this. This is not a new problem. As a matter of fact, in our culture, it's very often referenced as Wicca. I don't know whether y'all have heard anything like that. My first experience one-on-one with a young lady, I use the term loosely, who was in the Wicca movement, came to a church building there in Lancaster in Fort Worth, right south of Fort Worth, where I was doing a gospel meeting. And she walked in, and she had face paint on her face that was white as white can be, and had black eyeliner all over, and her hair was black and I think purple. And she was wearing solid black. And of course she was smiling and happy. No, she looked like death warmed over. And I'm looking at that going, why would anybody reject Christianity and follow a religion like that that makes you that happy? I don't get it, but you know what? It's nothing new. It's been around for years and years. It'll be around for years and years because people very often just totally reject God, and when they go groping in the dark for some other idol or God to worship, no telling what they'll come up with. So this is not a new thing. So when we look at Samuel, this is something that has plagued humanity for years. And in Samuel, Saul, because God told him, I'm cutting you off, I'm not happy with your work, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. In fact, if you look back up in verse 6, Saul tried to inquire of the Lord, even after God said, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. By the way, God's a lot more consistent than we are as parents. We'll tell our kids, well, I just don't want to talk about that anymore. But you know, importunity from a child, mama, 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 and pretty soon mom goes, what? Got her attention, worked. And very often parents, not being very consistent, will go ahead and talk about something they said they're not going to talk about. God isn't that way. God is not that way. When he said, I'm done with you, you're in trouble because he's done with you. And he was done with Saul. And so Saul, trying to inquire of the Lord did not answer him. And boy, I'll tell you what, and this is just an aside, people think they just call on God at any point in time of their life, in any manner, in any way, and it's going to be okay because God's going to answer them. That's not true. It's not Bible. There are times when God says, no, I'm fed up with this and I'm not going to answer you. We don't ever want to be found in that condition, okay? We need to search our lives and search his word and be sure that we're never in a situation where when we call on the Lord and we're serious about it, he says, nope, not going to happen. And so therefore, because he couldn't get to the Lord, and the way he would get to him or get in communication with him is either by dreams or the Urim, and that was a piece of furniture basically that a priest wore, wherein they could find out, and there's a lot of debate on how that worked, I'm not getting into that, but that's how you could find out what God said was okay or not, or by the prophets. In other words, there wasn't any prophets talking to Saul at this time. And so he told one of his servants, take off, find me a medium, find me a witch. And so this guy amazingly said, well, I just didn't know about this witch over in En Dor. Yeah, she can take care of it. And so they went over there. Now, one of the things I want to point out about witchcraft is it's all a fraud. It's fake. And I've had an argument with a guy, discussion with a guy on WBS on some of the questions I was answering. There is such a thing as witches, and they do have power, because look at what this woman did. Well, let's study this text, because this is the only text we have that tells us divinely from God how witches operate, okay? So this is what she did. He went to her, and he said, Saul told her, you're not going to be punished in verse 10. And the woman asked, well, who do you want me to bring up? Like she could do that. And she said, well, bring Samuel up for me. So the woman saw, it says, whom shall I bring up? She bring up Samuel for me. And when the woman saw Samuel, so she went through her incantations, and all of a sudden Samuel appeared. Now I want you to note in the context who the most shocked person was in that whole outfit there. Because Saul certainly wasn't. He was asking, well, what does he look like? Tell me what he's wearing. What's going on here? Saul wasn't worried about that part. This woman was. It says she cried out with a loud voice and told Saul, why did you deceive me? You're Saul. She knew enough about God. She knew enough about the Israelites, and she knew enough about King Saul and his circumstance to know this shouldn't have happened. So what was happening here wasn't her doing. And so therefore when Saul asked her, what does this guy look like? Well, immediately it was Samuel. He knew it was Samuel. And of course Samuel gave him some very bad news. He said, you're going to go over here and fight. But in verse 18, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon the Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Now, that's an interesting statement he makes there. You're seeing me right now, Samuel told Saul, because God is about to pound you in the ground, and he wants you to know you got this because you didn't obey him. I don't know what it was like for any of y'all growing up, but my dad always asked the most annoying question right before he gave us corporal discipline. Do you know, maybe some of you grinning, maybe you know what I'm talking about, because just before you start the licking, he'd say that, do you know why I'm doing this? And you don't dare go, well, duh, I did something terrible wrong. You didn't do that, because that'd just make it worse. Well, why do you reckon he did that? Because God does that all the time. Do you know why I'm disciplining you right now? Because you're not doing what I told you to do. And if there's any doubt in your mind, look at the context in which this question falls. This question is coming from Samuel, from the Lord, to Saul, who asked a witch to conjure up Samuel. Now, is he obeying God in any sense of the word? No. And you're getting told what you need to hear. You're getting told that, yes, you're about to die. Now, a smart man probably wouldn't have went to war, but Saul had never been accused of smart here in his later life, and certainly went on and he was killed. He and all of his sons. A great slaughter occurred. Many of the soldiers of Israel died, which goes to show, of course, when you do something wrong, it has impact on others too. And we need to be aware of that when we go about our daily life, what we say, what we do. Oh, and that brings us back around as a conclusion to this lesson about celebrating holidays whose origins are sinful. Okay? There's not a thing wrong at all with eating candy. And I think those jack-o'-lanterns are funny. Okay? But I can't speak for you, but here's my thinking on it, just based on how God expects us to be examples to others. When somebody looks at me as a Christian, what do they think I believe? I've heard this so many times, I'm just going to throw it back out there. You can preach a better sermon by the way you live than what you say. Well, let's use that, okay? Let's go that route. I don't buy it, but let's use that. You think you can preach a better sermon by the way you conduct yourself? How are you conducting yourself when there is an event that has roots in paganism, anti-Christian behavior? How are you, as a Christian, showing yourself to be a Christian when you get involved in things that have these kind of roots? I'm not saying it's going to be wrong for you to get some candy this week at 31st October. Okay, I'm not saying it's wrong to wear a costume, look kind of funny in public. People think I look funny in public all the time. That's not the point. What kind of example do I want to convey to my neighbors so they know who I am and who you are when something of this nature arises? Now, I know in our community, and the small communities particularly, everybody wants to get involved, everybody wants to be a part of things. I appreciate that. But somewhere along the lines, as Christians, we need to stand apart from the world. And sometimes it gets obvious when everybody's doing it, except them. And then we get persecuted, we get mocked, we get ridiculed, we get made fun of because, no, I'm all for candy. But there are some things that I'm going to be very careful about doing because I want people to see me and you as Christians in a small community that doesn't have a connection with anything that is not coming from God's Word. Saul's connection here with this witch was wrong. He should have been obeying God long prior to this. He was not. He was punished. You and I one day will be punished for everything we do. Our works will come up in judgment. What's our works? What are we doing that conveys to others we are Christians and we separate ourselves from the world? And by the way, let me recommend that the best time to buy Valentine's candy is February 15th. Because it goes half price then. And there's no connection to anything that may not be Christian, that may have its origins in paganism. A lot of folks will look at this lesson and they say, oh, that's just a detail, it's harmless, not a big thing. Okay, you can go that route. But I have taught you what I believe the Bible teaches, and I'm more than open to sit down and discuss your influence in a small community and what people will think when you participate in things that have roots and origins in paganism. And I just would call to your attention these kinds of things so that you can give it some thought. And then you do what you're going to do, because frankly, when you stand in judgment, I ain't going to be there with you. I'm going to be in judgment too, but nobody's standing beside me. Jeff's going to answer for Jeff. You're going to answer for yourself. If you're okay with it, you find for me in the book where it's okay so that I can too, because I love candy. I'd love to have some too with you. Now, this hadn't accommodated an invitation at all, but let me tell you, if your life is not right with God, we sing the invitation for the intention of encouraging people to change their life. You need to change your life, and it needs to be public, fine. If it's private, wonderful. But respond to the invitation as we stand together.